Did you know that a simple sheep once shaped entire kingdoms? Ever wondered how a fluffy animal changed the course of European history? Can you believe that the clothes on medieval backs built the grand cathedrals you visit today? Number 7. The lasting legacy of medieval wool. What remains of this massive industry that once dominated Europe? While we no longer see wool merchants ruling city councils or financing wars, their legacy surrounds us in surprising ways. The grand cathedrals of England, Wells, Exeter, Lincoln stand tall because of wool money. The Cotswolds, with their honey-colored stone villages and rolling hills, look the way they do because sheep farming shaped the landscape. Wealthy wool towns like Florence and Bruges still draw tourists who marvel at the architecture without realizing they're looking at wool wealth made solid. Family names tell their own story. If your surname is Webb, Weaver, Fuller, Tucker, Walker, Dyer, Shearer, or Shepherd, congratulations, you're carrying a professional wool trade title from medieval times. These weren't just jobs, they were identities so important they became permanent family labels. The wool trade created financial innovations we take for granted. Insurance policies, international banking, letters of credit, and complex accounting systems all evolved to serve the needs of wool merchants moving valuable cargo across dangerous seas and lands. Before Silicon Valley had venture capitalists, medieval Europe had wool investors funding commercial expeditions. Even language bears the imprint of wool. Spinning a yarn for telling a story, being dyed in the wool for something fundamental to your character, or pulling the wool over someone's eyes to deceive them. These everyday phrases connect us directly to medieval wool workers and their daily lives. Perhaps most importantly, the medieval wool trade established economic patterns that still shape our world. The idea that regions should specialize in producing what they're best at, then trade with others for what they need, this cornerstone of modern global commerce was medieval wool economics in action. England raised the sheep, Flanders wove the cloth, Italian bankers financed the process, and merchants distributed the goods across Europe and beyond. It was globalization before anyone had coined the term. The next time you pull on a wool sweater or walk past a historic European building, remember the complex story behind it. A story of sheep farmers and international merchants, of political power struggles and artistic patronage, of ordinary people whose daily work shaped extraordinary history. Number 6. The dark side, enclosure and exploitation. Was the wool trade all prosperity and progress? For many ordinary people, the growth of the wool industry came with devastating consequences. As demand for wool soared, land that had traditionally been used by peasants for growing food was increasingly converted to sheep pasture. The infamous Enclosure movement in England saw common lands, where villagers had grazed their animals and gathered firewood for generations, fenced off for the exclusive use of wealthy landowners raising sheep. "Sheep eat men," wrote Thomas More in his 1516 work Utopia, capturing the human cost of this agricultural revolution. Entire villages were sometimes cleared to make way for sheep farming. Families who had lived on the land for generations suddenly found themselves without homes or livelihoods. The population of rural areas plummeted as displaced peasants moved to cities, creating a new urban poor class. Working conditions in the wool industry could be brutal. The process of fulling beating the cloth to clean and thicken it was originally done by workers stomping on the cloth in vats of stale urine and fuller's earth, a clay-like substance. The invention of water-powered fulling mills mechanized this process but put many workers out of jobs. Dyers worked with caustic chemicals that damaged their lungs and skin. Carders and combers developed respiratory problems from constantly inhaling wool dust. Children as young as 7 or 8 worked long hours in the wool industry. Their small fingers were considered perfect for the delicate task of spinning, and they were paid a fraction of adult wages. Women who performed much of the spinning work often earned barely enough to survive despite working from dawn until after dark. The raw materials for dyes arrived through trade networks that were often built on exploitation. Alum, essential for fixing dyes to wool, came from mines where workers faced dangerous conditions and early death. Some of the most valuable dyestuffs came from regions where local populations were subjected to harsh colonial practices. Guild regulations, while ensuring quality, also restricted who could practice various trades. Women were increasingly pushed out of the more profitable aspects of textile production. Religious minorities faced limitations on their participation in guilds. The wealth gap between master craftsmen who owned workshops and the workers they employed widened dramatically. Tax records from the period show the growing inequality. In Florence, one of the centers of the medieval wool trade, the richest 10% of the population owned approximately 68% of the wealth by the late 14th century. Much of this wealth was concentrated in the hands of successful wool merchants and workshop owners. The environmental impact was equally concerning. Sheep grazing, when done intensively, damaged landscapes. Dye works polluted rivers and streams with toxic waste. Deforestation accelerated as trees were cut down to build ships for transporting wool and to provide fuel for heating dye vats. The wool trade's prosperity came at a price, one paid primarily by those with the least power to resist. Number 5. Cloth cities, urban centers of the wool economy. Have you ever wondered what medieval cities smelled like? In wool-producing towns, the answer is unforgettable, a pungent mix of sheep, human urine used for cleaning wool, dyeing chemicals, and the smoke from countless workshop fires. These sensory assaults were the byproduct of bustling urban economies built almost entirely on cloth production. Cities like Ghent, Bruges, and Ypres in Flanders, modern-day Belgium, transformed from small settlements into powerhouses through wool manufacturing. Ghent, at its peak, had over 60,000 inhabitants, larger than London at the time, with an estimated 60% of its workforce involved in textile production. The skylines of these cities were dominated by massive cloth halls where merchants displayed their wares, guild headquarters that regulated the trade, and the homes of wealthy textile magnates built with wool profits. The wool trade reshaped urban geography. Cities organized themselves around the production process, with different neighborhoods specializing in different stages of cloth making. Streams and rivers became essential infrastructure, powering fulling mills and carrying away the waste from washing and dyeing. The constant clack of looms provided the soundtrack to daily life. Florence in Italy offers a perfect example of a wool-transformed city. By 1338, the city had approximately 80 wool finishing workshops and 200 wool merchant companies. The Art della Lana Wool Guild directly employed roughly 30,000 workers in a city of about 100,000 people. Guild buildings, showcasing the wealth of the industry, still stand in Florence today, monuments to wool power. The wealth generated by the wool trade funded some of history's most magnificent buildings. In Bruges, the Cloth Hall with its towering belfry dominates the central market square. In England, the wool churches of East Anglia and the Cotswolds display elaborate architecture paid for by successful wool merchants eager to demonstrate their prosperity and secure divine favor. Urban governance itself was transformed by wool wealth. In many cloth-producing centers, textile guilds effectively became the municipal government. Cloth merchants and master weavers sat on city councils, decided policy, and judged legal cases. The political influence of these wool men extended beyond city walls. Kings and princes courted their favor, needing both their tax payments and their loans. Civic identity became inseparable from cloth production. Cities competed fiercely for reputation, with each developing signature cloths known throughout Europe. Scarlet of Brussels, Ray Cloth of Ghent, and Blues of Ypres were brand names that carried premium prices. Municipal regulations controlled every aspect of production to protect these valuable reputations, from the width of the cloth and the number of threads allowed to which dyes could be used. Social life centered around the guild structure that organized the industry. Guild halls hosted feasts, settled disputes, provided welfare for members who fell ill, and supported widows and orphans of deceased craftsmen. Religious brotherhoods connected to the guilds commissioned artwork and organized processions honoring patron saints of the various wool crafts. The urban landscape also revealed the industry's darker side. Tenement buildings housed the thousands of workers needed for labor-intensive cloth production. These crowded, poorly ventilated structures were particularly vulnerable when plague swept through Europe. The contrast between the grand homes of wealthy cloth merchants and the cramped quarters of the workers who made their fortunes could not have been more stark. Number 4. From raw wool to royal robes, the production process. What does it take to turn smelly sheep fur into something a king would proudly wear? The medieval production chain for woolen cloth was astonishingly complex and specialized, requiring dozens of distinct skills and trades working in careful sequence. The journey began with sheep farmers, who raised specific breeds valued for their wool qualities. English sheep, particularly from the Cotswolds, Lincolnshire, and Wales, produced wool prized for its length and strength. Shepherds developed careful breeding programs centuries before anyone understood genetics, selecting animals for desired wool characteristics. Shearing occurred once yearly, typically in June, creating a seasonal rhythm that affected the entire industry. Once sheared, the raw wool entered a complex commercial network. Local wool collectors purchased from individual farmers, then sold to wool merchants who assembled larger quantities. These merchants sorted wool by quality. Wool from a sheep's shoulders and sides was finest, while leg wool was coarser. The best wool might be destined for luxury fabrics, the poorest for rough blankets. Before spinning could begin, the raw wool required extensive preparation. First came washing to remove natural sheep grease, lanolin, and dirt. Workers then beat the wool with sticks to loosen tangles in a process called willowing. Next, the wool was greased with butter or oil to make it easier to work. Carding, combing the wool between boards covered with metal teeth, aligned the fibers in preparation for spinning. Spinning transformed loose wool fibers into usable thread. This was primarily women's work, so ubiquitous that the term spinster eventually came to mean any unmarried woman. Using drop spindles or spinning wheels, which appeared in Europe around the 13th century, spinners created thread of various thicknesses. A skilled spinner could produce about 1 pound of thread per day, meaning thousands of spinner days were embedded in a single large piece of finished cloth. Weaving brought together these threads on looms. The basic process involved interlacing vertical warp threads with horizontal weft threads. Medieval horizontal looms required 2 people working in tandem, typically men, as weaving guilds increasingly excluded women from the profession. Complex patterns required extraordinary skill to execute, with master weavers creating intricate designs for luxury fabrics. After weaving came fulling, pounding the cloth in a mixture of water, urine, and fuller's earth to clean, shrink, and thicken it. Originally done by foot in wooden tubs by walkers, giving rise to the surname Walker, this process was increasingly mechanized with water-powered fulling mills by the 12th century, one of medieval Europe's first industrial applications. The fulled cloth was stretched on wooden frames called tenters, using hooks that would catch on tiny imperfections, the origin of the phrase "on tenterhooks" for being in a state of anxious suspense. Skilled workers called burlers then examined the stretched cloth, removing knots and repairing any defects. Next came shearing, where specialized craftsmen used massive scissors to cut off excess nap, creating a smooth surface. The finest cloths might be sheared multiple times, with each cutting producing increasingly refined texture. Dyeing could occur at different stages. Sometimes the raw wool was dyed before spinning, sometimes the yarn before weaving, and sometimes the finished cloth. Each approach produced different effects in the final product. Dyers were highly specialized, often focusing on specific colors. Red dyers worked with madder root or the precious kermes insects. Blue dyers used woad or expensive imported indigo. Yellow came from weld or saffron. Quality control was rigorous. Guild officials inspected cloth at various stages, applying lead seals to approve pieces that met standards. Cloth that failed inspection might be cut, publicly burned, or its maker fined heavily. The entire process from sheep to finished cloth could take months and involve dozens of workers with specialized skills. A single large piece of high-quality cloth represented an enormous investment of human knowledge, labor, and time, explaining why fine clothing was so valuable that it was specifically mentioned in wills and used as diplomatic gifts between rulers. Number 3. Merchant princes and wool politics. Do you know why the British Parliament's ceremonial seat is a wool sack? This curious tradition, the Lord Speaker of the House of Lords sitting on a wool-stuffed cushion, dates to the 14th century and symbolizes something profound. Wool was not just a commodity but a political force that shaped nations. The politics of wool created unlikely alliances and bitter conflicts. English kings became enthusiastic supporters of sheep farmers, recognizing that wool exports could be taxed to fill royal treasuries. Edward III went so far as to wear only English wool clothing to promote the industry and forbade anyone in England from wearing foreign cloth. His famous motto, "In my time shall the cloth of gold be made an honor to my dignity and a comfort to my people." Wool wealth generated power that sometimes rivaled that of nobles and royalty. In Florence, the Medici family, later Grand Dukes of Tuscany and patrons of Renaissance art, built their initial fortune through the wool trade and international banking connected to it. The Bardi and Peruzzi families, also wool merchants and bankers, became so wealthy they could loan enormous sums to King Edward III of England to finance his wars with France. This financial relationship had dramatic consequences when Edward defaulted on his loans in the 1340s. The resulting bank failures in Florence contributed to economic instability throughout Europe. Wool money had become so integral to international finance that disruptions in the trade could trigger continent-wide economic crises. Control over wool production became a matter of national security and international diplomacy. England, as the primary producer of raw wool in medieval Europe, wielded considerable influence through its wool weapon. When tensions arose with Flanders, English kings could threaten to cut off wool supplies, potentially putting thousands of Flemish cloth workers out of work. Flemish cities, recognizing their vulnerability, cultivated alternative sources in Spain and Scotland. The wool trade spawned some of the earliest examples of economic protectionism. Cities and regions enacted regulations to protect their local industries. Florence passed laws making it illegal, punishable, by having a hand amputated for skilled dyers or weavers to emigrate and share their techniques with competing cities. England eventually banned raw wool exports entirely, requiring wool to be woven domestically before leaving the country to capture more of the value chain. Wool generated tax revenue that funded wars, castle construction, and court luxury. In England, the Great Custom on wool exports provided approximately one-third of royal revenue by the late 13th century. This steady income stream allowed kings to pursue military campaigns without constantly seeking approval from reluctant parliaments for new taxes. Guilds controlling various aspects of wool production became political entities with significant urban power. In Ghent, the Weavers' Guild could mobilize thousands of armed members during conflicts. In 1302, at the Battle of Courtrai, also known as the Battle of the Golden Spurs, Flemish textile workers defeated an army of French knights, proving wool workers could determine the fate of kingdoms. The wool trade fostered a pragmatic commercial diplomacy that sometimes overrode religious and national differences. Italian merchants maintained trade relations with Islamic territories despite papal prohibitions. During the 100 Years' War between England and France, commercial agreements often ensured wool continued flowing even as armies clashed. By the 15th century, wool interests had become so entrenched in governance that many European parliaments and councils were dominated by representatives of the industry. Their influence appears in legislation on everything from labor regulations and guild restrictions to foreign policy and currency values. The staple system, which required all wool exports to pass through a designated town where taxes could be efficiently collected, created concentrated economic power in cities like Calais, Bruges, and later Antwerp. These staple ports became centers not just of commerce but of political intrigue, as various interests competed for control over the lucrative wool flow. Number 2, the Golden Fleece, wool as medieval gold. Was wool really valuable enough to become a metaphor for legendary treasure? In medieval Europe, absolutely. The story of Jason seeking the Golden Fleece in Greek mythology resonated with medieval people who understood perfectly well that wool was a treasure that could transform lives and kingdoms. The economics are staggering. By the early 14th century, woolen cloth accounted for approximately 80% of England's exports. The Italian banking houses of Florence operated branches in London primarily to handle wool trade finances. When we read that medieval merchants became wealthy from trade, that often specifically means the wool trade. Raw wool prices varied dramatically based on quality and region of origin. Cotswold wool from England might sell for twice the price of average wool due to its fine, long fibers. The account books of Francesco di Marco d'Attini, a merchant from Prato, show that in the 1390s, a sack of high-quality English wool cost approximately the same as 6 months' salary for a skilled craftsman. The value multiplied at each processing stage. That same sack of wool, when transformed into finished cloth, might be worth 5 to 10 times its raw value. Luxury dyed fabrics commanded astronomical prices. Records from 1373 show that fine scarlet cloth from Brussels cost 11 gold florins per yard, at a time when a master mason earned about 8 florins for a month's work. For ordinary people, clothing represented a major investment. A simple wool tunic might cost a laborer several weeks' wages. This explains why clothing was so frequently mentioned in wills and passed down through generations. It also explains the secondary market in used clothing, with specialized dealers known as frippers refurbishing and reselling garments. The extreme value of wool made it a target for thieves and smugglers. English owlers, wool smugglers, developed elaborate networks to avoid export duties, moving wool illegally to continental buyers. Cloth merchants traveled with armed guards to protect their valuable cargo. Ships carrying wool or finished cloth were prime targets for pirates in the North Sea and English Channel. Wool taxation funded kingdoms. The English crown derived so much revenue from wool export duties that these taxes could finance wars without requiring additional parliamentary grants. When Edward III needed to raise funds for his military campaigns against France, he seized thousands of sacks of wool from English merchants, essentially forced a loan that was repaid through future tax credits. The wool trade drove financial innovation. Italian merchant bankers developed complex financial instruments to handle wool transactions. The bill of exchange, a predecessor to modern checks, allowed merchants to transfer large sums without physically moving coins. Insurance contracts protected valuable wool shipments. Double-entry bookkeeping evolved to track complicated wool transactions across multiple currencies and jurisdictions. Wool wealth became cultural capital through conspicuous consumption and patronage. Successful wool merchants commissioned artworks, funded church construction, and established hospitals and schools. In death, they specified elaborate tombs, often incorporating sheep or wool-working tools in their memorial brasses and sculptures. The wool churches of East Anglia and the Cotswolds stand today as monuments to the prosperity wool brought to those regions. Status was displayed through clothing made from expensive wool textiles. Sumptuary laws or regulations dictating who could wear which types of clothing specifically mentioned fine wool fabrics as restricted to certain social classes. Only nobles could wear the finest scarlet cloth in many jurisdictions. The message was clear: high-quality wool clothing functioned as a wearable display of wealth and position. Wool even became diplomatically significant. Gifts of fine English broadcloth or Flemish tapestries were exchanged between rulers. The Order of the Golden Fleece, founded by Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, in 1430, became one of Europe's most prestigious chivalric orders, its name and emblem explicitly referencing the source of Flemish wealth and power. Number 1. Sheep Empire, Geography of the Medieval Wool Trade. Did you realize that fluffy sheep created Europe's first truly international industry? Can you imagine that the humble woolly creatures grazing in medieval fields connected mountains in Scotland to markets in Damascus? The medieval wool trade spanned a geographical range that would be impressive even by modern standards. From the windswept islands of the Hebrides to the sun-drenched fields of Andalusia, from English highland pastures to Italian city-states, a vast network connected landscapes and peoples through the movement of wool and cloth. England stood at the heart of this wool world, particularly prized for its high-quality raw wool. The sheep-dotted hills of the Cotswolds, Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, and the Welsh marches produced wool that commanded premium prices throughout Europe. By the 13th century, England was exporting approximately 40,000 sacks of wool annually, with each sack weighing 364 pounds and representing the fleeces of about 250 sheep. Simple math reveals the scale. Over 10 million English sheep were providing wool to continental Europe each year. Flanders, roughly modern-day Belgium, became the primary processing center for this English wool. Cities like Bruges, Ghent, and Ypres specialized in transforming raw wool into finished cloth. The relationship was symbiotic. English sheep farms produced more high-quality wool than England could process, while Flemish weavers had developed sophisticated techniques but lacked sufficient local wool supplies. This geographic specialization created Europe's first truly integrated economic region. Ships constantly crossed the narrow channel waters carrying wool eastward and finished cloth in multiple directions. The Flemish cloth then entered broader distribution networks reaching into Germanic lands, France, the Italian peninsula, and beyond. As demand grew, other wool-producing regions gained prominence. Spain, particularly Castile and Aragon, raised merino sheep whose extremely fine wool became increasingly valued for luxury textiles. Scottish Borders wool, though generally coarser than English varieties, found markets for more utilitarian fabrics. Iceland exported wadmal, a coarse woolen cloth that served as a form of currency throughout Scandinavia. The Italian city-states, particularly Florence, Milan, and Venice, emerged as both manufacturing centers and commercial hubs in the wool economy. Florence especially became renowned for high-quality finished cloth, importing raw wool from England and Spain, then processing it into luxury fabrics sold throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. At its peak in the early 14th century, Florence produced approximately 100,000 pieces of cloth annually. Geographic features shaped the industry in profound ways. Fast-flowing streams provided power for fulling mills, where cloth was cleaned and thickened. Access to specific plants for dyeing influenced where certain types of cloth finishing occurred. Alum mines, particularly those at Tulfa near Rome, held strategic importance since alum was essential for fixing dyes to wool fibers. Maritime routes became the superhighways of the wool economy. Venetian and Genoese galleys carried finished cloth to Constantinople, Alexandria, and Beirut. Hanseatic ships moved wool products through the Baltic and North Sea. The development of larger cargo vessels, particularly the cog and later the carrack, was driven partly by the needs of the wool trade. Land routes were equally vital. Mountain passes through the Alps and Pyrenees saw constant mule trains carrying wool products. Rivers like the Rhine, Rhone, and Po became commercial arteries for the trade. The famous champagne fairs of medieval France at Troyes, Provins, Lagny, and Bar-sur-Aube served as temporary marketplaces where wool merchants from north and south would meet to trade. The geography of wool influenced settlement patterns and building styles. In England, the prosperity brought by sheep farming led to the distinctive stone villages of the Cotswolds, built with the profits of wool. In Flanders, cities expanded rapidly to accommodate wool workers, creating dense urban environments dominated by cloth halls and guild buildings. Even religious geography was shaped by wool. The Cistercian monastic order became major sheep farmers, establishing abbeys in remote areas ideal for large-scale wool production. Their standardized abbey plans, replicated across Europe, often included facilities for processing wool from their extensive flocks. This vast wool network created cultural exchange alongside commercial connections. Techniques, designs, and fashion trends moved with the wool and cloth. Practical knowledge about breeding, weaving, dyeing, and financial management spread through the commercial relationships established by the trade. So did your wool sweater's medieval ancestors travel farther than you have?